Have you ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted deeply? Joseph was sold by his own brothers, left behind as if his life had no value. But how could someone abandoned in such a way find the strength to forgive and reconcile? The story of Joseph reveals a powerful truth. What men plan for evil, God uses for good. And in the end, the forgiveness Joseph offered transformed not only his own life, but also that of an entire nation. Hold on tight, because this journey is one of redemption and healing. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, which ignited hatred in his brothers. Imagine the pain of being betrayed by those who should protect you. They throw him into a pit and then sell him as a slave. And what about you? Have you ever felt abandoned by someone you loved? This story isn't just about Joseph, it's about us. How many times have we been hurt by those closest to us? As Christians, the question remains, how do we react when we are betrayed? As Joseph walked to Egypt as a slave, God was walking beside him. Even when it seems like everything is lost, God's plan never fails. Just like Joseph, we may be going through our own Egypt, but God does not abandon us. He is preparing something greater. Joseph's conflict reminds us that often the deepest wounds come from those we love. And when we face these betrayals, how do we deal with them in light of our faith? Joseph was sold as a slave, humiliated and wronged. From a beloved son, he became a forgotten prisoner. But in every moment of pain, God was with him. How many times do we find ourselves in our own desert, unsure why God allows certain trials? The truth is that amid chaos, God is orchestrating every detail. It's not easy to see this when we are in battle. Joseph could have revolted and lost faith, but he stood firm. Why? Because he knew that God had a greater purpose. As Christians, we need to remember that adversities are not the end of the story. Just as God was preparing something grand for Joseph, he is also at work in our lives, even when we can't see it. Your desert might be the path to the purpose God has for you. From slave to governor of Egypt, it seems impossible, but that's exactly what God did in Joseph's life. After years of suffering, he found himself in a position of power and authority. And here's the crucial point. Joseph did not exalt himself. He recognized that all of this came from God's hand. As Christians, this teaches us that our promotion, our success, is not merely the result of our effort, but of divine grace. Joseph did not forget where he came from, and neither can we. When God elevates us, he has a greater purpose. Joseph was used to save an entire nation from famine, and you might also be being prepared for something great. What God did for Joseph, he can do for you. When we submit to his plan, he places us in places we never imagined. The moment everyone was waiting for, Joseph finally reunites with his brothers. Those who betrayed him are now before him, unaware of who he truly is. Imagine the tension. Joseph had absolute power for revenge, but he chose something much harder, to forgive. Here's the challenge for us as Christians. When we are hurt, our first reaction is to retaliate or hold on to resentment. But Joseph shows us a different path. He tested his brothers, not out of revenge, but to see if they had changed. And in the end, he opened his heart to forgiveness. What would we do in Joseph's place? Would we hold on to bitterness or allow God to heal our pain with forgiveness? That is the true power. Not to repay evil, but to overcome it with the love of Christ. Joseph trusted that God was in control, and that's how we should act when forgiveness seems impossible. The moment of revelation arrives. With tears in his eyes, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Shock, regret, and forgiveness intertwine in a deeply emotional moment. What Joseph said to them is something we, as Christians, should always remember. You planned evil against me, but God turned it into good. This is the essence of Christian forgiveness. It's not about ignoring the pain, but seeing the divine purpose through it. God transforms wounds into healing, tragedies into redemption. Joseph understood that his suffering was part of God's greater plan. And what about us? Can we see that our struggles are also opportunities for God to act powerfully? Reconciliation is not just between Joseph and his brothers, but between God's plan and the human heart. When we trust in his providence, reconciliation becomes an act of faith. Joseph teaches us that forgiveness and God's providence are always intertwined. He suffered, was betrayed, but never lost sight of the divine plan. When we look at our own lives, we can see that the wounds and challenges we face today might be God's instruments for something much greater tomorrow. As Christians, we need to embrace this truth. Joseph's journey was not easy, but it was necessary. The same is true for us. The forgiveness he offered his brothers was the key that opened the door to healing and restoration. God does the same for us. He transforms pain into purpose and betrayal into blessings. The question remains, are we willing to trust God in the same way? Because in the end, what seemed like a defeat was, in fact, Joseph's greatest victory. And what seems impossible in our lives today, God can transform for good. The choice is ours. Just as Joseph chose to forgive and trust in God, I invite you today to do the same. Perhaps you are facing a betrayal, a hurt, or a desert in your life. Remember, God is working behind the scenes, preparing something greater. Forgive, trust, and allow God to transform your situation into a great victory. If this message touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of forgiveness and divine providence. May this story of Joseph inspire you to live with faith and hope,